A quiet town, a beautiful house. An 87-year-old man believed he had found love. He hadn't. He thought she cared. He let her into his home, his life, even his bed. She smiled. She stayed. And slowly, she took everything. One signature, one cup of tea, one final breath. Welcome back to Truth in Shadows. Truly grateful to have you here. If you're ready, let's begin. In the quiet mornings of Willowdale, Edward Langston's house always seemed to wake up a little slower than the rest. His home stood apart, tall windows, trimmed hedges, an iron gate that never squeaked. People passed by and whispered of his success, his wealth, his solitude. He was 87, but still moved with a kind of deliberate pride, like every step was a statement that he still mattered. He had outlived friends, rivals, even his wife. What remained was a house filled with expensive silence. When Linda Harper first walked through his door, she didn't make much noise either. She arrived with a calm voice, clean shoes, and eyes that noticed everything without judgment. She didn't ask questions. She folded towels just the way he liked. She served tea without waiting for instruction. He didn't remember when she started finishing his sentences. At first, she left in the evenings. But by the second month, she stayed late. By the third, she began bringing a toothbrush. No one said anything the day her car started staying in the driveway overnight. In the kitchen, she adjusted the spice rack without asking. In the study, she dusted the photo of Edward and his late wife without comment. One evening, he walked into the living room and found her sitting in his chair, legs tucked beneath her, reading one of his old business journals. She smiled. He said nothing. The next day, the chair was still warm when he came down for breakfast. She had already made coffee. It was strong, the way he used to drink it before his heart medication. Linda had a way of filling the space without making it feel crowded. She didn't demand attention, but somehow always held it. When she entered the room, the temperature didn't change, but something else did. A softness settled. A suggestion of intimacy. A whisper without sound. Edward, who once insisted on picking his own ties, began asking for her opinion. She started choosing them for him. He didn't mind. In fact, he looked forward to her choices. They were always neat, subtle, flattering. One Thursday, he told her she looked beautiful. She thanked him. That night, he asked her to stay. The next morning, he referred to her as my companion when speaking to the gardener. She began learning his schedule better than he knew it. His pills were always on time. His socks were already matched. She replaced his old cologne with something softer. Less like power. More like memory. At the local market, people started to notice they shopped together. Linda held the list. Edward pushed the cart. A woman at the register said, "It's lovely to see him with someone again." Linda smiled politely. Edward didn't hear her, his hearing aid wasn't in, but the smile she gave the woman was not polite. It was something else. Like she knew a secret no one else had earned. Charlotte noticed the change long before she visited. Edward's emails had become shorter. His handwriting on birthday cards shakier. When she called, he didn't answer right away. Linda usually returned the message. Neighbors said they were a charming pair. One mentioned seeing them on the back patio at dusk, drinking wine, her hand resting lightly on his arm. So gentle, the neighbor said. Like something from a movie. But no one could say what kind of movie. Inside the house, Linda's touches spread. A velvet throw blanket appeared on the couch. A new teapot in the kitchen. A lavender candle in the guest bathroom. None of these were Edward's taste, but he said nothing. His house began to smell like her. She started calling him darling when she thought no one could hear. Once, Maria the housekeeper walked in too early and caught Linda fixing Edward's collar, then pressing her lips gently to his forehead. Maria paused. Linda didn't flinch. She smiled. He forgets sometimes, she said. At night, one bedroom light stayed on. Just one. In the mornings, Edward looked rested. Softer. Quieter. He told a friend over coffee, she makes me feel like I'm still wanted. Still needed. He laughed. But the laugh didn't last long. It ended in a cough, then silence. He didn't notice that he had stopped writing checks. That Linda now handled the groceries, the repairs, even the emails. He didn't ask why his calendar was always empty. He liked that life had become so simple. She never spoke about her past. Not even when Edward asked. Not much to say, she would reply, wiping the counter. Just the usual. But Charlotte found it strange. She searched Linda online. No family photos. No wedding. No social media. Just a job history that stopped 5 years ago. When Charlotte asked Edward about it, he waved her off. Not everyone wants their life on the internet, he said. But even as he said it, he looked at Linda, as if to check if that was the right answer. The weather stayed unusually calm that spring. The town seemed to drift peacefully, like everything was moving underwater. And in Edward's home, the stillness grew heavier. Linda played music, sometimes classical, low volume, always near dusk. The same piece, again and again. A soft piano melody, full of longing and restraint. It played as she poured his wine. It played when she adjusted the curtains. It played when he closed his eyes and leaned into her shoulder. Some nights, she read to him. Old novels. Love stories. War memoirs. One night, she read a passage about a man who gave up everything for a woman who didn't love him back. Edward didn't react. But Linda closed the book and said, "That's not how it ends." He smiled faintly. But his hands trembled as he took another sip of wine. A week later, she changed the locks. No one noticed. She said it was for safety. She said everything so calmly. Like silk slipping off glass. And still, no one asked why the mail was never in the box, or why Linda now answered all the calls. Or why Edward stopped wearing his watch. She said he forgot it often. He said nothing. At the edge of town, an old man was fading. And a woman smiled beside him. Some smiles don't mean peace. Some hands don't comfort. And some hearts, never loved at all. By the time summer rolled in, something in Edward had shifted, subtle at first, like the way a shadow moves when the sun begins to dip. He no longer greeted the day with the quiet dignity that once defined him. Mornings, which used to begin with the rustle of a newspaper and soft hymns drifting from the radio, now began in silence. The old leather-bound Bible on his nightstand remained unopened, gathering dust like a forgotten relic of someone else's life. Church Sundays slipped away without explanation. One missed service turned into 4. Edward, who once wore his suit and tie like a uniform of purpose, now sat idle on the porch in his robe, watching the street with eyes that no longer searched for anything. When friends called to check in, they were met with the soft, syrupy voice of Linda, who always answered before the second ring. "He's resting," she'd say, or "he's not feeling up to it today." Her tone was gentle, almost maternal, but there was a finality to her words that discouraged follow ups. The gate had closed, and she was the only one holding the key. Appointments came and went without Edward showing up. The barber down the block stopped expecting him every Thursday. The pharmacist stopped asking why he wasn't picking up his prescriptions. Linda handled it all now. She walked into the pharmacy with a confidence that silenced questions. She stood by the front desk at the clinic, flipping through Edward's calendar on her phone, rescheduling things without ever consulting him. It was as if she'd stepped into a role that no one had offered her, but no one dared revoke. The first real rupture came in June, when Charlotte visited. She hadn't seen her grandfather in a few months and expected the usual warm welcome, the frail but cheerful hug, the long, meandering talks in the sunroom. But Edward opened the door like a man distracted, eyes foggy, smile missing. He gestured weakly for her to come in and then retreated to his armchair like a ghost folding into its favorite corner of the house. Charlotte noticed the changes quickly. They weren't dramatic, but they were wrong in the way a picture frame is crooked just enough to be unsettling. In the master bathroom, beside the sink, sat a pink toothbrush that wasn't there before. Neatly placed next to Edward's. A matching toothbrush holder, something decorative, with little floral engravings, held them both, like a silent promise no one had spoken aloud. Her eyes dropped to the floor, where a pair of soft, lavender slippers sat tucked beside Edward's bed. Not just resting there, but living there, folded into the routine, like they belonged. On the nightstand, 2 glasses of water stood side by side. One had lipstick on the rim. Above the fireplace, in a silver frame, was a photo that seemed almost like a provocation: Edward and Linda, in matching bathrobes, their shoulders brushing, their smiles too polished to be accidental. The frame looked new. The photo looked recent. The message was clear. When Charlotte asked about the finances, it wasn't an accusation. It was a daughter's concern wearing a granddaughter's voice. "How are things going? With the estate, and everything?" Linda's smile was effortless, almost beatific. She didn't blink. "He trusts me now," she said, like that explained it all. And in a way, it did. That same week, Maria, the housekeeper who had been with Edward for over a decade, walked out. She left without drama, without complaint. Just a quiet goodbye and a vacuum left halfway across the living room rug. Later, she told a friend in town, "That woman acts like the wife, not the help." There was no bitterness in her voice, only a kind of baffled warning, like she had seen a storm coming through a keyhole. Edward began to shrink, not in stature, but in presence. He no longer entered rooms. He drifted into them. His steps were slower, more uncertain. He spoke less, sometimes not at all, until Linda prompted him with a word, a glance, a hand on his shoulder. He waited, always, for her to speak first. As though unsure of what was allowed. As though language itself had become a privilege she granted. At first glance, it looked like love. A late-life romance, tender and protective. But if you watched closely, you'd notice the difference. This wasn't love that made Edward bloom. It was something else, quieter, darker. He wasn't just in love. He was receding, becoming smaller within himself, like a man trapped behind his own eyes. There were days when his gaze would linger on Linda's silhouette as she moved through the house, not with affection, but with a kind of silent wondering, as if trying to remember when the shift happened, and why he hadn't stopped it. Linda took over more than just the errands. She controlled his schedule, his diet, his interactions. Visitors were filtered through her. Emails went unread. Mail piled up on the kitchen counter unless she deemed it worth opening. Even the dog, Jasper, who once followed Edward everywhere, now curled beside Linda's feet, trained by tone and habit. She brought in new furniture. Subtle things at first. A modern chair in the study. A scented candle in the entryway. The heavy old drapes were replaced with lighter ones that fluttered in the breeze, so delicate they made the whole house feel less grounded. Edward never objected. Or maybe he did once, and never again. He'd begun to smile in strange moments, like when she corrected him in front of guests or when she gently scolded him for forgetting to take his pills. Smiles that didn't quite reach his eyes. Smiles that flickered on and off like faulty lights. There was a kind of quiet theater in everything Linda did. The way she touched his hand at dinner. The way she refilled his glass before he asked. The way she laughed a little too loud at his fading jokes. It all looked like care. It all almost felt like love. But the truth lived in the pauses. In the way Edward flinched, just slightly, when she brushed past him too fast. In the way his fingers trembled when he signed checks. In the way he sat in his chair after she left the room, staring at the floor, as if trying to find something he'd dropped, something small, but vital. Perhaps his will. Perhaps his voice. Once, when Charlotte called to follow up, Linda picked up. Her tone was sweet, but clipped. "He's napping," she said. "He's tired a lot these days. You know how it is." But Charlotte didn't know. Edward had always been sharp. Always alert. A man who kept his appointments with military precision. A man who remembered birthdays without reminders. The tiredness wasn't natural. It hung on him like a coat someone else had put there. In one quiet evening, Edward sat by the window, watching the sky dim. Linda brought him tea and placed it in his hands. He thanked her in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. She smiled, kissed his forehead, and left the room. When the door clicked shut, Edward held the teacup between his palms but didn't drink. He looked outside at the empty street, eyes clouded with something beyond thought, something more like memory, or regret. The steam from the tea curled upward, disappearing into the air like a secret no one would hear. Somewhere inside that house, a man was still there. But the space around him was growing tighter. And the silence was beginning to hum. A home can look peaceful while a war unfolds within its walls. And sometimes, the softest voices carry the sharpest commands. August 3rd dawned like any other summer morning, humid air clinging to windows, cicadas humming in the distance, and the scent of watered grass drifting from nearby lawns. The sun was high by the time Mr. Heller walked up Edward's front path. He carried no concern at first, just a light frown of curiosity. Edward hadn't collected his paper. The porch light, strangely, was still on. Mr. Heller knocked twice, then again, harder. No footsteps echoed back. No rustle behind the curtain. He tried the doorbell. Silence answered. He cupped his hand to the glass, peering inside. Everything looked still, too still. The curtains were drawn just enough to blur the outlines of furniture. Something felt off. A cold itch crept up the back of his neck. He dialed the police. The officers arrived swiftly. Polite, cautious. They didn't have to force the door, it was unlocked. Inside, the house was dim and quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful but smothered. Furniture sat perfectly arranged. A faint scent of lavender drifted through the air, mixed with something else, something faintly metallic. They moved room by room until they reached the bedroom. Edward lay in bed, tucked under the covers, arms resting gently at his sides. His expression was neutral, his skin pale and slightly sunken. There was no struggle, no sign of distress. Just stillness. As if sleep had arrived, and simply never left. Paramedics confirmed it quickly. He was gone. A soft murmur of radios followed. Officers moved methodically, taking photos, recording details. It wasn't until Linda arrived just half an hour later that the atmosphere shifted. She stepped inside like someone coming home after a day at the salon. Her hair was neatly pulled back. She wore soft gray slacks and a pale blouse. No tears. No panic. Only a measured calm, wrapped in a smile so careful it felt like porcelain. "Oh no," she said gently, her voice almost a whisper. "He must have passed in his sleep. I didn't hear a thing." She looked at the officers, not with shock, but with understanding. She offered them coffee. She sat in the kitchen as they worked. Not once did she ask to see Edward's body. The coroner's report came back within days. There was something wrong. A chemical imbalance in Edward's system. The presence of a sedative strong and fast-acting. Not part of his usual medication. Not a dosage any physician would prescribe to someone his age, or any age. It wasn't just present. It was saturated. Enough to quiet a storm inside a man's body, enough to make sure he'd never stir again. The bottle the pills came from was found in the bathroom drawer. Label fresh. Prescription name, Linda Harper. Issued just 3 days prior. That single detail pulled a thread. And with it, everything began to unravel. Detectives returned to the house with a different energy. Not gentle, not deferential. Focused. Quiet questions turned into formal inquiries. Cabinets were opened. Files examined. And in the study drawer neatly stacked beneath a set of bank statements they found it. A will. Printed cleanly. Dated in June. Signed at the bottom in Edward's familiar handwriting. But different somehow. Slightly shakier. Less confident. The document named Linda Harper as the sole beneficiary of his entire estate. House. Savings. Cars. Assets. Everything. There was no mention of Charlotte. No charities. No longtime friends. And no signature from Edward's lawyer. The man had handled Edward's legal affairs for over 2 decades. He hadn't drafted this. He hadn't witnessed it. He hadn't even known it existed. When Charlotte was contacted, she fell silent on the phone. Her voice, when it returned, was brittle. "That's not possible," she said. "He wouldn't do that without telling me." But the ink was dry. And then came the footage. A quiet branch of the local bank provided the security tape. August 3rd, around 11 a.m. A woman entered the building in a cream blouse and sunglasses. She walked with a light step. Her hair was styled neatly. She approached the teller with a smile. In her hand, a check. Large. Issued from Edward's personal account. Dated the same day his body was found. She deposited it with ease. Spoke with warmth. Left no trace of anything unusual. The cameras caught everything: the way she slid the paper forward, the way she adjusted her purse strap, the small nod she gave the teller before walking out into the sunlight. It wasn't until the police replayed the footage a second time that something became clear. There was no hesitation in her actions. No flicker of doubt. No grief. It was the kind of calm only a person absolutely certain of their plan could wear. The word suspicion turned into something sharper. The detective in charge called Linda in. She arrived wearing navy slacks and a pale yellow cardigan. Her nails were manicured. Her demeanor was pleasant. She asked if they wanted coffee. They didn't. She sat down, folded her hands on the table, and looked at the detective with an expression that hovered between sincerity and exhaustion. "I'll tell you everything," she said. Just like that. No denial. No delay. No lawyer present. The room, small and windowless, grew heavy. The detective clicked his pen. The tape recorder clicked on. And Linda began. Her voice was soft. Her words deliberate. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She spoke like someone recounting a long story she had memorized, one sentence at a time. She said Edward had grown lonely. Vulnerable. That he clung to her more and more, trusting her with things that made her uncomfortable. She said she never meant for it to go so far. That she was only trying to help. That his mental state had declined, that he was forgetful, confused, paranoid. She said he insisted on changing his will. That she resisted. That he wouldn't hear of it. That he begged her to stay. Then she paused. And smiled. A small, strange smile. The kind that slips through when the truth is heavier than words. "There's more," she added. The room didn't move. No one breathed. But she didn't continue. Not yet. Outside the station, the sun dipped behind a thin curtain of clouds. Light faded. And somewhere, inside the evidence room, a plastic pill bottle lay on a cold steel shelf, its label pristine, its contents almost empty. Even in silence, the truth had begun to speak. And it would not stop. Not now. Because the dead leave behind more than just questions. They leave behind echoes. And some echoes never fade. The interview room was cold not by accident, but by design. Pale gray walls, one mirror, one camera. The table between Linda and the detectives was narrow, metallic, and unforgiving. The kind of table where truth and lies sit too close together. Linda Harper sat on one side, her back straight, her blouse uncreased, her breath even. She hadn't asked for a lawyer. She hadn't shown a flicker of fear. Her face was calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap like someone waiting for a polite conversation. The detective across from her clicked his pen twice. The small sound echoed louder than it should have. The silence between them was not empty, it was pregnant with questions, strategies, and a creeping sense of disbelief. They'd seen people lie. They'd seen people panic. But rarely did they see someone enter the room looking prepared. Linda blinked slowly when the first question came. "When did you last see Edward alive?" Her lips parted, and her voice came out smooth, even gentle. "August 2nd. That evening." She didn't falter. Didn't stammer. He was tired. That whole week, he seemed worn out. Not sick, not exactly. Just finished. She looked at the detective, her eyes steady. He was lonely. You could feel it in the way he moved. In the way he waited for silence to end. The officer said nothing. Linda continued. "We had dinner together. I made pasta. He opened a bottle of red, his favorite, from that vineyard he loved in Sonoma. We played music. The old records. The ones that crackle just a bit at the start. He laughed more that night than I'd seen him laugh in months. We talked about love. And death." Her voice caught there. But not with emotion, more like the rhythm of a well-rehearsed script needing a beat of silence. She added, "He asked me to make him tea before bed. Chamomile. Always chamomile. He said it helped him sleep." Her eyes softened, and for the first time, a thin smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "He thanked me," she said. "Said he was lucky to have someone who understood him. And then he said, maybe it was time to rest." A pause followed. The kind of pause that makes the room feel smaller. The detective leaned forward. "What do you mean by that?" Linda glanced at the ceiling, then back down. "I think he was saying goodbye." The next question sliced through the calm. Did he ask for help? Linda exhaled. A long, slow breath. He didn't ask directly. But he didn't need to. I could see it in his eyes. She picked at a thread on her sleeve. "He looked at me like someone ready to let go. Someone who'd made peace with everything." The detective scribbled a note. "So you made him tea?" She nodded. "Of course. I do that most nights." "And then?" Linda looked up. "He went to bed. I went to the guest room. I left him alone, like he asked." There was something strange about the way she said it. Like it was a favor. Like leaving him alone that night had been an act of mercy, not abandonment. The officer pushed the next question carefully. "You didn't check on him?" "No," she said. "He said he wanted space. He said, he wanted silence." "But you didn't call 911 in the morning?" Linda's face didn't change. He looked peaceful. "I didn't think it was urgent." Her words floated into the air like fragile glass. The detective turned a sheet toward her. "Our team reviewed the camera logs from the house. There were no lights turned on after midnight. No movement. No one entered his room after 11:47 p.m. Linda didn't flinch. "Your story," the officer said slowly, "doesn't match the footage." For the first time, Linda's posture shifted. Not by much, just a slight tightening in her shoulders. Her eyes narrowed for half a second before she smiled again, softer this time. "He loved me," she said, voice lower. "He trusted me. He gave me everything. He knew he could. He wanted to." The silence returned, this time heavier. Another detective entered the room, younger, sharper. He carried nothing but a question. He sat beside his colleague and leaned across the table. "Did you help him die?" he asked. The question didn't land with force. It landed with quiet. Linda's gaze fell to the floor. Her lips pressed together. Then, she spoke not with confidence, but with a different kind of certainty. A kind that came not from rehearsing the truth, but from choosing it. "He didn't say no," she whispered. The words hung there. Not a confession. Not quite a denial. But heavy. Loaded. Final. The officers didn't move. No pens scratched. No chairs squeaked. She had drawn a line. And stepped just up to the edge. Outside, rain had started soft at first, then steady. A cleansing rain, they'd call it on the news. But inside that room, nothing was washed away. The storm had already come and gone. What remained was silence. And questions that no longer needed answers. Because sometimes, the absence of a no, is louder than any scream. And trust, once twisted, becomes something sharp enough to cut. Even love, in the wrong hands, can be fatal. The verdict didn't come with gasps or cries. There was no outburst in the courtroom, no slamming fists or weeping relatives. Only stillness. Like the final chord of a song that leaves the air vibrating just long enough to remind you it mattered. Linda Harper stood motionless in her tailored suit, hands folded, lips pressed into a line too fine to read. Her eyes, those soft blue eyes that once spoke of calm and care, now stared ahead with something colder behind them. Not regret. Not shock. Just the emptiness that comes when the performance is over and the stage goes dark. The toxicology report had made things clear. Painfully, irrevocably clear. The sedative in Edward's blood was no mistake. The concentration was far beyond what could be explained by confusion or miscalculation. It wasn't one pill too many, it was a deliberate drowning, a slow suffocation disguised as sleep. He didn't drift away naturally. He was carried out, gently but firmly, like a man escorted from his own life before he'd finished his final sentence. Linda had insisted he gave permission. That he wanted it. That he welcomed the silence. But the court didn't believe her. Not after the check dated the morning of his death. Not after the fresh will signed in unsteady ink. Not after the timeline she couldn't explain. One by one, the people who had known Edward stepped into the witness box. Charlotte was first. Her voice didn't crack. She wore black not for mourning, but for clarity. Her words were sharp, her eyes unwavering. She told the court about the toothbrush in the bathroom. The slippers by the bed. The photo by the fireplace. She spoke not as a grieving granddaughter, but as a woman forced to watch a loved one fade under someone else's shadow. Then came Maria. Quiet, composed. She spoke in a steady voice, recalling the subtle changes, the rules, the shifts in tone, the way Edward had begun to wait for permission to speak. She remembered how Linda had started answering the phone, intercepting messages, deciding who was allowed through the door. It was like he belonged to her, Maria said. Like the rest of us had to ask to borrow him. The pharmacist testified next. He remembered Linda picking up the sedatives. He remembered the oddity of the dosage, the speed with which she filled the prescription. She said it was for anxiety, he told the court. She smiled the whole time. And then there was Mr. Heller. The neighbor. His voice was soft, but his memory was sharp. He told them about the porch light left on. The newspaper untouched. The way the house looked too quiet that morning, even for Edward. Piece by piece, The story formed. A life pulled inward. A man growing smaller in his own home. And a woman who smiled too often, and too easily. The judge called it a quiet and calculated betrayal. His tone didn't rise, didn't tremble. He simply read the words, letting them settle into the wood and air and silence of the room. He spoke of trust twisted into control, of affection weaponized into isolation. He described it as a betrayal not just of Edward's body, but of his will, his memory, his autonomy. Linda Harper was sentenced to 30 years. She blinked once. No tears. No final words. Only a breath, long and even, as though she'd been holding it the entire time and could finally let it go. The courtroom emptied slowly. Charlotte remained seated a little longer, hands clasped in her lap, staring at the place where Linda had stood. The space felt different now. Not lighter, not darker. Just quieter. Edward's house was sold within a month. Strangers moved in, young couple, 2 kids, a golden retriever. They painted the walls, replaced the garden stones, tore out the rose bushes Linda had planted. They didn't know the stories held in the floorboards. They didn't feel the echo of footsteps no longer walking the hall at night. His belongings were divided. Some were boxed up and donated. Others sold at estate auctions, scattered to homes that wouldn't know the history behind the leather-bound books or the mahogany desk or the tarnished cufflinks. The old chair where he used to sit by the window ended up in a thrift shop across town. It now holds coats and handbags, waiting quietly for someone to sit down and remember something they never lived. Edward gave everything. His heart, his trust, his comfort. In the end, he gave his body too. Not in a moment of rage or violence but in a slow surrender. One shaped by loneliness, folded into a quiet routine, disguised as love. And in return, he lost everything. The tragedy wasn't loud. It didn't scream. It didn't shatter windows or make headlines. It whispered. And sometimes, it smiled. Because the cruelest betrayals don't come from strangers in the dark, they come from the hands that tuck you in at night. And the softest voice can carry the sharpest knife. Sometimes, betrayal doesn't scream. It whispers. Smiles. Waits. Edward Langston believed in love. But what he found was something else entirely. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts below. Because in the end, truth always lives in shadows.